It's a spiritual battle. Listen to the, let me callers. I have a guest with me for a minute, a few minutes here, not for a bit. And so hold on. I will get to your calls. I want to talk to Michael Tracey to get some understanding about what's really going on out there in the world. So Michael's been here before. He is back. And for those who might not know, Michael Tracey is an American journalist and political commentator. And you can support him at www.mttracy.net. And I'll have him give out that again for the before he leave. I wanted to talk to Michael about this whole Epstein thing and the Iran what's happening in Iran. Michael, how you?
I'm trying to keep my head up, I guess. How about you?
All is well. Welcome back.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
So, Michael, I want to start out because a lot of people seem to be interested in the Epstein file, which is interesting to me that they are that interested in that. First, let me ask, why are people interested and should they be interested in this whole Epstein situation at all?
Well, I said that I've never begrudged anyone for being interested in the Epstein
Right.
issue.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just the case that this person had a truly extraordinary degree of connections or associations or ties, you might say, with an extraordinary cross section of people. Just to give one quick example, when this latest tranche of so-called Epstein files came out, I was going through some of the old records from the initial Florida investigation in the mid to late 2000s that he was a target of. And there were message pads, meaning people would call his house in Palm Beach and leave him a message, and one of his assistants would write the name of the caller on the message pad, and then Epstein would call them back or not. And it turned out he was getting phone messages from Holly Berry, or at least somebody named Holly Berry. And I don't know of any other Holly Berry than the one who's the famous model and actress, right? And before that, I had no idea that Holly Berry had anything to do with Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not accusing her of any wrongdoing, obviously, but it is just, I think, intrinsically interesting to people that he had these relationships of one degree or another with everybody from Donald Trump to Bill Clinton to Bill Gates, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Steve Bannon, Noam Chomsky, you name it. So that's one level of intrigue that I think is very understandable. And then if you overlay that with people's visceral response to anything to do with real or perceived child sex trafficking or pedophilia or something along those lines, obviously that provokes very strong emotional reactions from people. And then if you further tell them that there's been a giant cover up of unspecified dimensions, and it has to do with what they perceive to have been grave child sex crimes, then yeah, it's a perfect recipe for perpetual intrigue. And on the Epstein story, now we have this internationalized component where it seemed to embroil the British royal family. It seemed to involve Israel to some degree, seemed to involve other European countries, even Russia, Saudi Arabia. So I think the reasons why people are so incessantly intrigued by this issue are perfectly explicable. I just think that they've been looking at it overwhelmingly from the wrong direction.
Oh, okay. I want to ask about that, but what has the mainstream media um, um, gotten wrong about this whole thing? Because that's where
Well,
people are getting their information from.
yeah, unfortunately on this issue, it's sort of unique in my experience, having covered a whole variety of issues for over a decade as a member of the media, so to say, 15 years, I guess, more accurately. There's sort of a convergence between the misconceptions that are promoted by both the mainstream media, so like CNN, MSNBC, what have you, or MS Now, as it's called, and also the more alternative online podcast-oriented media. They both are, I would argue, mired in different delusions. So it's not as though you can go to some alternative media source for the most part and get an accurate correction to what the mainstream media is misleading you on this story, even though you can on other issues. Um, here's just one example of something that never gets covered in either the alternate or mainstream media,
Okay.
which is that people have been very frustrated, as have I been, by what they regard as excessive redactions to these Epstein files that have been released starting in December with the first round and then January with the second round. And when they see page after page with block after block of full black redactions, they think to themselves, gee, this must be the government trying to cover something up or protecting some child sex trafficking perpetrator. Like that's the immediate assumption.
Yeah.
But what they don't understand is that for months, the lawyers who have become insanely wealthy on the basis of the representation of purported Epstein victims, those same lawyers have been arguing in federal court that the DOJ ought to be obliged to impose the most sweeping possible redactions, essentially, on these files, because they claim that there's this gigantic universe of purported victims who deserve to have any file that they wish redacted or even removed entirely at their command. And the DOJ had to deploy hundreds of lawyers who would otherwise be involved in entirely different tasks for something like 6 weeks or 2 months, going through meticulously every single file. And there were millions of them. And to redact stuff at the behest of these purported victims who haven't been adjudicated as victims ever in any kind of adversarial process, in the overwhelming majority of cases. And also only have to self-declare, self-identify themselves as victims in order for the DOJ to then agree to redact or withhold materials on their behalf. So I've been saying, if people want to criticize the Trump administration for anything, or the Trump DOJ, criticize them for this irrationally lax redaction criteria that they've acceded to at the direction of these purported victims and their profit-seeking lawyers. So that's one issue that you haven't heard about that, have you?
No.
You haven't seen that on CNN or any of these dopey podcasts who are or social media people, right?
I have
so
not.
You don't get it anywhere on this issue.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's really amazing. There are conservatives who are turning on Trump, according to the stories, about over this whole Epstein thing connection. Should they be doing that? I mean, why are they doing that? Turning on him because of that? And they don't even know the truth.
I don't think it's for me to necessarily tell what any particular conservative ought to do.
Right.
I would just say that I think
why are they doing it? Why are they turning? Not. I mean, if they want to turn, that's fine. But why are they doing that?
Well, I think one reason is that a lot of people in the right-wing or conservative media were very reckless in how they discussed this issue for a number of years, including the current FBI director, Kash Patel, including the former deputy FBI director, Dan Bongino, who's now back to being a participant in conservative media, because they would push out these most outlandish theories around what the Jeffrey Epstein story supposedly signified to their audiences and get them primed to expect some kind of dramatic revelation once Trump got back in office after the 2024 election. Kash Patel famously went on the Benny Johnson show, who's like one of the top conservative podcasters, in late 2023, and told the then FBI director in the Biden administration, Christopher Wray, quote, "Put on your big boy pants and tell us who the pedophiles are," as though Christopher Wray had a list of pedophiles that he had sitting on his desk or in a vault somewhere and could have just released it at any time and informed us who all these satanic pedophiles were. And that was always a incredibly silly misconception of what the Epstein story signified, but that was being peddled out by these conservative influencers and media personalities. So then when those expectations collide with reality and Trump gets back in and he orders this, review of sorts of the existing investigatory file, they have a very difficult time conveying to the public, including to their own base, what the reality was. And it wasn't helped by people like Pam Bondi, people like Kash Patel, Bongino, not being very competent in their communication. And even Trump himself, kind of fumbling this in terms of just screaming out the word hoax and then thinking that people were not going to draw suspicious conclusions from that. Even if on some things Trump has been correct. Like Trump has said, gee, I don't know if I want to put out all these files because there could be a lot of phony stuff in there and it could wrongly impugn lots of people.
Yeah.
Which that was correct. But when you kind of commingle that with him just saying stuff like hoax, it's going to make people suspicious if they don't have the requisite background knowledge to understand the true sort of nature and scope of what it is that we're talking about.
What made people, Michael, hear about a story and they don't know the real truth at all? Because they weren't there, they don't know at all, but they're just hearing about it. What made them make a decision and then decide in some cases to take an action like they're turning against Trump and stuff like that. What made people make a conclusion to a story that they just hear about and they don't even know the detail, the real detail? Why do
Yeah.
they make decisions?
I think it's an unfortunate reality of our current information environment. So, just for example, over the weekend, I was looking through some of the top shared TikTok videos over in the past month or 6 weeks having to do with the Epstein story. These things go insanely viral, millions upon millions of views. A lot of young people use TikTok in particular to gain their political knowledge at this point and learn about the world as they see it, which is probably not the greatest idea, but they do it,
Right.
whether we like it or not. And I just saw one video where it's this guy who's astoundingly popular on TikTok pulling up what seems like an official looking FBI document, right? So it seems like it must have some truth to it to the untrained eye. And he's reading out these most fantastical allegations about what he's saying is like, murder of infants and cannibalism and all this sort of stuff. And, his followers on TikTok, I guess, attribute some degree of authority to this guy. And he's presenting this information as though it has any bearing on anything factual
Yeah.
or reality based. And it's simply not. So what I've been saying is that there's been a huge quantity of ambient folklore that's been stirred up on this issue for many years. That's my coinage. You can use it if you want.
I will. I love it.
So, people will just sit back and they'll watch a Netflix special on it, right? Or they'll listen to some YouTuber talk about it. They'll see a headline or a social media post, and they don't really take the time to do any sort of firsthand research or to look at the primary source material. And on some level, you have to understand that people have jobs and lives, and they're not they're not crazy like me, where I have the ability and the wherewithal and like the job to do that. So on some level, you can't blame them. But where I do place a lot of blame is with the journalists or the people who at least purport to be in the media to one degree or another, who you would think have some degree of an obligation to be a bit more exacting in their standards, so then
Right.
they can convey a more accurate understanding to the wider public. And they've really failed disastrously on that front.
That's amazing. We keep hearing that the victims were minors. The victims were minors. Can you clarify the actual age range of the women?
Well, one of the problems is we don't know how many victims there even allegedly are.
Right.
They've been saying since last July, right? When I guess this is another stumble of the Trump administration, when they put out that now notorious memo on July 6th that was unsigned, but it was under the letterhead of the DOJ and FBI, where they, on the one hand, say, look, everybody, it turns out, there's no quote unquote client list. There was no blackmail operation. There was no large scale child sex trafficking. There was no additional prominent like VIPs whom there's a predicate to charge with any crimes. But at the same time, they introduced this new claim, which was that there's over 1,000 victims who were harmed by Jeffrey Epstein. Now, when I first read that back in July, I thought to myself, if they're saying that Jeffrey Epstein sexually abused or raped or trafficked over 1,000 victims, why wouldn't they just say that? Instead, they use this strange weasel wordage, saying he victimized somehow over 1,000. That's a huge number of alleged victims, and that's been repeated by politicians in both parties and in the media ad nauseum since July. And it turns out that number was basically phony, based on new Epstein files that have come out. That number supposedly includes both purported victims, the majority of whom, based on everything that I've ascertained, would have been adults when they claimed that they were victimized. But then that number, over 1,000, includes the alleged victims' family members. So I was asking, okay, does that mean that Jeffrey Epstein went around, fondling their uncles or something? That doesn't even make any sense. But so there are persons who were under the legal age of consent in Florida, where this whole thing started, who have alleged to be victims. And there was one person who was below the legal age of consent in Florida, whom Epstein did plead guilty to having procured as a minor for prostitution. She was 17. Okay. So, not to get too into the weeds here, but like if they had gone one state north to Georgia, consensual sexual activity with that 17-year-old, whether you like it or not, would have been legal. And if you don't like it, feel free to petition the Georgia state legislature to change the law.
That's right.
But the law is what it is. And so, and there are other people who are under 18 who have made those allegations, but it's a very small minority of this total universe of alleged victims that we're constantly told exists. Some of the alleged victims are women people who are women in their 20s who accepted like a luxury vacation to the US Virgin Islands to hang out, and with in some cases like professional models who, you know, were not like poor trailer trash people who like got like manipulated into something, but were like relatively affluent models who were like on the covers of magazines and stuff. And
That's
they
amazing.
accept an invitation to go to Epstein's island, and then they don't say anything untoward ever happened for like 20 years, and then all of a sudden by 2023, JP Morgan opens up its checkbook, and there are, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars available for anybody who can claim any degree of victimization by Epstein ever, and their claims aren't really even really scrutinized or fact checked or analyzed at all by the media or the adjudicator or the administrators of those settlement programs. And then all of a sudden, you know, these women are now Epstein survivors, not even victims. They're now survivors, like they're Holocaust survivors or something. Like it's this great historic atrocity.
That's amazing.
So my problem is the conflation and the lack of distinctions that are ever drawn, and the laziness with which the media portrays this stuff, and then that gets echoed out by social media and creates these very false conceptions of what went on here, such that just this past Saturday, there was a nationwide, they called it like an anti-pedophile march or mobilization across the country, where they have people saying, you know, they ate babies, and, you know, the billionaires are eating babies, and we have to, you know, the pedophiles are unpunished. You know, I'm sorry, I'm not like, I'd be the first person to notify the authorities if I ever was told or had reason to believe that there was an actual pedophilic predator that was a danger to children. Okay.
Amazing.
But that's not what we're really talking about here with the Jeffrey Epstein story.
Yeah.
And it's just so strange that so many people have been led to believe that this is the unadulterated truth, and nobody actually ever gives them a corrective other than me.
And then they go out and repeat it as though they know the truth of it. They act like they had the real truth. And then followers hear that and they start repeating what they say. But let me ask, we all know that women are sluts and men are slut makers, right?
I don't know if that's quite how I would characterize it, but if that's your view, you're more than welcome to it.
And so what I want to know, Michael, is why when women accuse men of sexual stuff or whatever, they always hide the women's faces, but they expose the men's faces, and they never show both sides. If they're going to show the men who have been accused, they should be showing the accuser too, but they have this disdain against men, and they love destroying men. And we all know that women lie, and they lie just like they'll make up a lie. They'll be crying and lying. When they cry, they're lying, right? And they'll be lying. We know that women lie, especially on men. If they gotta show the faces, why don't they show the women faces and the men faces? Why is it so one-sided? If they were doing that to women and not to the men, there'd be a big uproar about it. Why are they allowed to do that to the men but not to the women, knowing how easy it is for women to cry and lie?
Well, you know what, Jesse? I would love if you would direct that question to the Trump Department of Justice, because that's exactly the criteria that they've employed to impose redactions on these files.
Yeah.
They've said it explicitly. The Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, came out on a press conference January 30th and said, we have presumptively redacted the facial imagery of every woman, with the exception of Ghislaine Maxwell, whether or not there was any even claim to victimization, much less whether they ever tried to investigate whether the claim to victimization was legitimate. So, I mean, I think that's a ridiculous standard. And meanwhile, every man has their face presumptively unredacted. So what happens when you see these photos coming out where the woman has her face presumptively blacked out, whether or not she ever even alleged that she was victimized by anything, and the man's got his face unredacted, and they're like, you know, I don't know, at some function, or they're posing for a photo or whatever. The instant thing that people assume must have happened is that the man in the photo victimized the woman, but that's totally fictitious. And, you know, that's just one factor that's caused what I'm now referring to as this mass hysteria and moral panic that has gotten so out of control that it's even dictating how people view the conflict in the Middle East right now. If you're on any social media platform, you'll see, you know, viral post after viral post, whether it's X, YouTube, Reddit, TikTok, Instagram, Rumble, that they're all proclaiming this is a war for Epstein. This is the Epstein war. This is the Epstein regime, they sometimes claim.
What a
Donald Trump
mess.
did this to protect pedophiles. Donald Trump did this to cover up his own child sex crimes. And look, I'm a critic of the war myself. I think it's a horrible idea, but like I'm trying to be a rational critic, right? I'm not trying to be a
Right.
critic in like in some like Looney Tunes land, who and this whole issue has bred such irrationality that I think it's actually really destructive on so many different
It
fronts.
it is. I don't know who's guilty or not guilty in this whole situation, but I know it's wrong to show the men faces but not the women faces. And do you agree with me that when she's crying, she's lying?
She meaning all womanhood.
Yes. When she's
I think
crying,
that's a
she's
bit of an
lying.
overgeneralization, but I think if anybody of any gender gets overly emotional about something, that necessarily inhibits their capacity to reason. So when a man gets
Absolutely.
overly emotional, he might not cry as frequently as a woman, but I think, he also can get pretty irrational if
Yeah.
his emotions are guiding him rather than his reason.
Well, I am 100% sure that if there need to be any marches happening or stuff going on, something needs to be done to stop these people from showing the men faces, but not the accusers. They need to, and then a lot of this stuff will stop if they show these women, whether they tell the truth or not. If they show their faces, I guarantee you a lot of this mess will end. But
And
these
another thing on
women
that,
know
another thing
that
on
they're
that,
going to
yeah.
be hidden in the background, and they can say whatever they want to say about any men.
Well, I mean, another thing on that score is that none of the purported victims now in 2026 are children. Like you could see an argument that if there were actual children victims of sex crimes,
Yeah.
that they would be entitled to some degree of redaction to protect their identities, right? But the youngest any of these alleged victims can be nowadays is like in their mid 30s. And most of them, if not all of them, would not even have been children at the time that they were depicted in any of these files, meaning their images or photos taken of. And if they were children or like minors, let's say, then they wouldn't have been like 6 or 7 or 10 years old or something, like an actual like school children. If like that, like when people say children, I always thought they're mostly referring to like elementary school age children. Now, any 17-year-old can be said to be a child when in normal everyday speech, like if you saw a group of 17-year-olds hanging out, you wouldn't say, "Oh, hello, children." You would say, "Oh, hello, high schoolers or teenage." But everything again on this story, everything gets conflated to propagate a particular narrative that is the most incendiary and that is the most geared toward convincing people around the world now. It's not just the United States.
Right.
This is the big, huge scandal in Norway, Slovakia, Great Britain, France, you
Amazing.
name it. Yeah, but to convince them that this is fundamentally a pedophilia crisis. Now, if it was like a genuine pedophilia crisis, I would also be hysterical and outraged about it because I actually do object when, children are sexually preyed upon. And anybody does who's sane.
Right.
Like that's just, by and large, overwhelmingly, that's just not at issue here in this Epstein story, and yet it's been presented as such to stoke up the biggest possible furor, and it's having all these political ramifications where like anybody now who sent an email to Jeffrey Epstein in like 2013 has to lose their livelihood, has to put out this groveling apology, has to have their reputation destroyed. I mean, they're doing it to Noam Chomsky, who is a 97-year-old man who had a stroke and is debilitated and can't even respond for himself.
Wow.
And he's a left-wing scholar and very prominent. And you could disagree with him on the merits on things, but to slime his reputation like this is despicable. And the same has also happened to people on the right. And I'm against all of it.
Yeah, Mike, I want to ask you about the war, but I got to ask this first. Well, I got to ask this in 2 questions about this thing because I really don't care about it at all, to be honest. But why are men hated so much? All men, not just white men, black men, Jewish men, all men are hated. That there is no problem with destroying men. There's not like an outcry about it or anything. Why are men so hated that the world seems to be willing to destroy them and they use women to do that? Why is that?
Well, as it pertains to the Jeffrey Epstein story, when people talk about pedophiles, right, which is the most reviled
Well, I'm
group
really
in society.
talking about, it's not just in this story, but in most cases, probably all cases, when women they're married and they want to take the man's children, they can easily go to court and just lie on the man. Oh, he beat me, or he molested a child, or and they say these things, and the world just say, yeah, that's true, destroy him. But they wouldn't do that to the women. Why do they hate men so much? And they're so easy. They love destroying men. What is that about?
Yeah. My answer is going to pertain to the Epstein story, but it's going
Okay.
to be relevant to a broader theme,
Okay.
as you're sort of invoking here, which is that, when you mention the word pedophile, right, which is considered to be the most reviled subgroup in society, and rightly so on some level, if somebody is actually sexually abusing like a 3-year-old, okay,
Right.
um,
Michael,
but
hold that point. Let me take a quick break.
okay,
I want to hold you over just to finish that, and then tell me why you're against the wall, and then
okay,
I'll let you go.
yep.
888-77 Jesse. A quick break. Back in a moment. Check out Punchy's Coffee. I have my own coffee now. Punchy Coffee is good. Every bag is roasted to order. Freshest flavor. Top quality. Specialty grade beans. Good. Every dime goes back to Bar, my nonprofit. And we are rebuilding the family by rebuilding the man. So when you're drinking coffee and enjoying it, just know you're helping somebody. Amazing coffee. Punchy has his own coffee now. What the? And it's so good. All the way from the plantation to my own coffee. Who would have thought? Did that coffee come from the plantation? Did I pick my own coffee? Check it out. Go to rebuildingtheman.com, rebuildingtheman.com/stores, and get Punchy's Coffee. All right, folks, welcome back. 888-77 Jesse. I'm skipping over the commercials now. I want to go back to my guest. It's so interesting. Michael Tracey is with me. He's an American journalist and political commentator. Michael, before we get back into the subject, the discussion, tell the folks how to get to your website or whatever you want to promote.
Yeah. So it's mtracey.net. That's Tracey with an E. So mtracey.net. And it's the same on X/Twitter and YouTube and so forth.
And so you were responding to the question that I asked, why is it so easy to destroy men in the world?
So I think a reason for that thematically overlaps with the Epstein story in this sense. When you talk about pedophiles, right, which is rightly considered to be the most reviled subgroup in any population, if what we mean by pedophiles are people who actually do sexually abuse or molest or rape actual children, like a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or something like that. Obviously everybody who is sane finds that wholly contemptible. But the men who, when we're talking about pedophilia, overwhelmingly the perpetrators of a pedophilic act are going to be men, right? So pedophilia almost goes hand in hand with something that depraved men would do. And when we're talking about sexual abuse overall, not just pedophilia, but sexual abuse in general, by and large, in the overwhelming majority of cases, the perpetrator of a genuinely sexually abusive act is going to be a man. So when we have these sexual hysterias about sexual abuse of one degree or another, real or imagined, the villains in that story are going to be men. And matters of sex have always enticed and intrigued and, enthralled people since like the dawn of humanity.
Right.
And if there's ever somebody who's the wrongdoer in a sexual scenario, it's overwhelmingly going to be a man. So I think when we have these environments in which a sexual hysteria is so dominant, and obviously it's a huge feature of the Epstein story, but you could name a million other examples. When people are pointing the finger at who's responsible, ultimately, it's going to be a man in like 99 out of 100 cases. So I think then people take that to mean that men are therefore worthy of disparate treatment in circumstances such as like a custody battle or something to do with a child support payment. I'm not an expert in family law necessarily, but
Right.
there's a long-standing criticism of how those courts operate, where they're tilted against the man, or the burden of proof is higher on the man. Because I guess it would be the case that if somebody is going to be abusive between the man and the wife in a situation, it's probably by and large, especially physical abuse. Okay, maybe emotional abuse is different, but in terms of physical abuse, just by virtue of a man having superior strength to a woman biologically, in the main, that's going to be the man who's probably going to be assumed responsible if we're just talking about averages. So I think that gives some insight into the question you asked me, but it's a big topic, and I probably can't do it justice at the
Right.
moment.
But the reality, Michael, because human nature is evil, it's no good in human beings. Women are doing to young people what they're accusing the men of doing. We just don't hear about it. They don't report it. Most of the time, the guys don't report it, or they don't talk about it. And women have always been doing this too, but no one talks about it. I counsel with men and women around the world, young and old. I cannot tell you the number of times when I've not had grown men tell me that when they were boys, their mothers would have sex with them, or their mothers would make them sleep with them over the father, or they would put the father out, or they would treat them in a sexual way. Their mother would do it to them. Or their babysitters, or sometimes their school teachers, female school teachers, and their female babysitters. But it's just not talked about. And so it looked like it's just a man thing to do. But I promise you, in reality, and another thing, women are as physically abusive to men, if there is such a thing, as men are being accused to women, especially nowadays, because men have been told, don't defend yourself, don't fight her back. If she hits you, don't hit her back. She is a woman. And so these women are gone nuts as beating up the husband. They smack them in the airport, anywhere, and get away with it. So women are as violent or even more violent than men. It's just not being talked about in both areas.
Yeah, you might be right about that, but in terms of like who can inflict the most damage just by virtue of biological strength, like that's going to be the man.
But if
Right,
she's
because
brave enough to
the
hit
woman
him,
might be able to flimsily slap you, but like if a man throws a haymaker, then he can do a lot more damage just given his muscle mass.
right on. But if she got to be brave enough to smack a guy, she already know he's stronger. He should smack him back, knock him down. I mean,
Well, I'm not going to advocate domestic violence. I
no,
have
I'm
enough
not
on my
either.
plate.
But what I'm saying is, it calls self-defense, right? If somebody gonna hit you and hurt you physically, don't you have a right to protect yourself physically, no matter who
What I
it
tend to
is?
advise is if you're in a situation like that, I think it's most prudent to try to de-escalate rather than reciprocate and escalate the violence. And actually, that might be analogous to what's going on now in the Middle East.
Well, I'm not encouraging that. I tell men to call the police when the wives are verbally abusive or physically abusive. Call the police, put them in jail, and throw the key away.
I mean, if you can't diffuse a situation in your personal life or with your romantic partner without getting the police involved, then I think maybe you have some other problems.
Amazing. So one other quick thing about Epstein guy. I want to know from you, if you know, what is it about one man, Epstein, that was able to get all these people from around the world, according to the reports, into his life? And what was it about him that so many men and women are so interested in him that he had the power like that to? They acting like Epstein had so much power that he made these people go to his house. He made them have sex. He made them do what he wanted them to do, as though he had all this power. What is it about that one guy that has so much power over so many people around the world?
Well, first of all, he was incredibly wealthy. And if you have a lot of wealth, then you can hold functions at your lavish properties and invite lots of interesting people to them. And, a bunch of them are probably going to show up. Whereas if you're dirt poor, they're probably not going to come out to your shack or to your one bedroom apartment. Right. So the wealth is obviously, I think, the main factor there. But he was also, I think, a pretty charismatic, charming person. I think he definitely, once he made his fortune, he devoted himself mostly to philanthropic efforts, which is why he had relationships with a lot of academics who he was funding the projects of around issues like astronomy and physics and mathematics and so forth. So he had some intellectual or quasi-intellectual interests, but he was also into the arts. He was a philanthropic person, given this the massive wealth that he had accumulated. And he was also somebody who definitely was just a consummate networker. Like, he loved forging these connections. And he did it all around the world. Like, he had a posh luxury apartment in Paris that this former French minister, I don't know if he visited that particular apartment, but like, he used that as like as a launch pad to get involved with like European people. And it was the same in the United States. And he could give political contributions. It's like what a lot of wealthy people do if they have the money, if they have like, FU money is sort of like the online joke about it. You don't have to care about like earning an income anymore because you've made so much money that it self generates
That's
at a certain
amazing.
point. Yeah. So I think
So
that's the most salient factor there. And, he was good looking, I think, why I'm a heterosexual guy, but I can acknowledge that.
so
So,
was
it
he
was everything added up to just him being, I guess, like a person that people were gravitated towards.
because they wanted something from him and he wanted something from them. So he is not to blame for what they have done, right? Because they wanted something from him, he wanted something from them, and both people came together, and that's what you get.
Yeah, but sometimes there's nothing even necessarily to blame the other person
Right.
for. Like, if you
Yeah.
attended a little social soiree that he held at one of his properties, as he often did, and he invites, Steve Bannon and Woody Allen and Noam Chomsky and like Ehud Barak or to something, then people assume, oh, if they went to Epstein's townhouse for this little get together, that must have been something that was sexually sinister going on. But like, there's
Right.
virtually no evidence of that.
Yeah.
It's just what people assume. So I don't even know what those people have to necessarily atone for, other than that there's this swirling mythology around this stuff where everything gets looked at through a certain, condemnatory prism that is not really tied to any rational understanding of the facts and evidence.
What a mess. So this idea that this guy was controlled by Israel, that's not even true, huh? Or is it?
I
I
mean,
don't want to put
controlled by
words.
Israel. I mean, I think that would be a vast overstatement. He did have, if you want to say that, put it this way, ties to Israel, like Ehud Barak we
Like,
just mentioned. He was the former prime minister of Israel. Epstein did have a personal and business type relationship with the former prime minister of Israel. He also had a business, or he also had relationships with the current U.S. president and the former U.S. president, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. He also had connections with somebody who had just had to resign from the British government, who was formerly the UK ambassador to the United States, Peter Mandelson. So we had connections to the British government. A Norwegian diplomat just had to resign, and a former Norwegian prime minister reportedly attempted suicide, just given their connection to Epstein. A minister in Slovakia had to resign. He
that's
knew
amazing.
Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He met Fidel Castro. He met the Pope. So, like, look,
Wow.
I understand that he did have, certain dealings with people associated with the Israeli state. There's no doubt about it. But on the internet in particular, people get so myopically fixated on the Israel connections at the exclusion of everything
Right.
else that I question like the rationality with which they're viewing this Israel connection that they want to spend day after day
That's
fixating
amazing.
on. Because the idea was that if he was running a honeypot blackmail operation at the direction of Israel, like that's the theory that I think people are most inflamed about, and why it is that they want to emphasize the Israel connections. But there's just no evidence that there was a honeypot blackmail operation. They found, the FBI itself said in these new files that they found no evidence that he had any hidden cameras set up in any of his bedrooms or any other private areas in any of his houses. Now you could say the Trump DOJ and FBI, they're just in on the cover up, but okay, then you're never going to be satisfied
Right.
because you're never going to accept any countervailing evidence at all.
How rich was he? Do you know?
When he was rearrested, when he was federally re-prosecuted and indicted and rearrested in July of 2019, his lawyers had to declare on his behalf what his assets were because he was trying to petition for bail, which he was denied. But they put his net worth at around 650 million. And I don't know how accurate that was, if it was all inclusive, but it was in that ballpark.
That's amazing. So let me ask, because of time, let me ask, are you for, I think you've already said it, but are you for or against what the Great White Hope is doing in Iran right now?
I do not support it.
You know who
I
the
think
Great
it's
White
crazy.
Hope is, right?
I would infer that would refer to Donald J. Trump, our favorite president.
I rest my case. Some
Yeah, I mean,
some people call him amazing. What manner of man is this? The wind and the sea obeys him. Some people call him king, and they hold king rallies around the world. Some people call him daddy, but I call him the Great White Hope, Donald Trump.
Yeah,
We think about. Go
yeah.
ahead.
The Secretary General of NATO does, in fact, call him Daddy, which is a little creepy. I was at the NATO summit when he unveiled that nickname. And there are people, I guess, who refer to him as some kind of king, which is creepy in a different way. I think, Trump does. I think I would say in the second term, my attitude toward Trump has shifted going back to the 2024 election because he has this way about him now where he seems to be on this almost crusade where he thinks that he could just barrel through the world, overthrowing governments, abducting leaders like he did in Venezuela, destroying now the whole country of Iran or the government and imposing a leader that he picks because the Iranians aren't going to pick it. Donald J. Trump is going to pick it. He declared himself the ruler of Venezuela, the ruler of Gaza. He wants to seize Greenland. He wants to now seize Cuba, he says. He wants to seize Panama. I mean, when is this going to end? This is like, is he like Alexander the Great? Is he, is he on this just global conquest? Lindsey Graham, you should have seen him over the weekend. He couldn't have been more giddy, proclaiming how Trump was going to steamroll through Iran and he was going to go right to Cuba. It's just like I don't remember in 2024 Trump saying that like his key campaign pledge was like to take over much of the world and seize the territory. People got the impression that he was going to not start any new wars, which I always said was foolish at the time because that was not what he was pledging. Really, if you actually looked at the details, and that was not really what he did in his second term, even though it became this cheap talking point. So with Iran, I mean, what's the end state? What are they trying to achieve here? Are they just going to like keep bombing all the infrastructure of this country? Hegseth, the defense secretary, who now declares himself the war secretary, so I guess they were jonesing for a war. They said today's going to be the most intense day of bombing yet. So what are they bombing? I mean, the joint U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign resulted in them blowing up this like oil production facility or oil field that's creating like chemical rain. It's just going to sicken people who live in Tehran or the vicinity for ages. And they don't articulate what the war is really intended to achieve as an end state, other than just vaguely repeating this mantra over and over again that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. They've totally discredited U.S. diplomacy by doing a fake pantomime of negotiations, both last June when before the first round of bombing, and then before this most recent round. And look, I mean, if you voted for Donald Trump thinking that it was going to put an end to, quote, regime change wars, as people like Tulsi Gabbard assured us, then you've been humiliated because like this is the mother of all regime change wars that they've now declared. So no, I'm opposed to it. And I think at the minimum, there should be pressure placed on Trump and his administration to articulate more clearly what the costs of this potentially are going to be to the American taxpayer. They're spending billions of dollars a day, we're told, on dumping munitions in the Middle East when, I don't know, I would like to see them actually, rebuild some roads and bridges like they keep always saying they're going to do, instead of giving it to all these defense contractors / war profiteers who love Donald Trump so much and were convened at the White House so they can expedite their production of military industrial capacity. And they do that all subsidized by the taxpayer. So no, I'm against it on virtually every conceivable level.
But the president said, and I don't know, but he said that he's stopping these people before they're able to build nuclear weapons and attack us. And it sounds like they have proof that they were in the process of doing that because they see us as America as the big Satan and they see Israel as the little Satan, and their mission is to conquer the world. And so the president's uh, gave the impression that he's doing this before we are attacked. Should he wait until we attack and do something, or should he do something prior to being attacked?
First of all, the idea that Iran even has the ability in any way to quote take over the world is laughable. They couldn't
But
even take
not
over
just
their own region
But
if
not
they
just
tried.
Iran, but
Uh,
the whole Muslim religion thing is about conquering because everybody else are infidels and not worthy of life. It's
so
whole
now,
about
so, so
conquering.
now we're at war with Iran, which is a Shiite Muslim country, on the basis of a general religious crusade against all Muslims. Iran and the Gulf Arab states, which are Sunni Muslim, they're currently in conflict. So there's conflict within the Muslim world, but we're now going to punish all Muslims by going after Iran and assassinating the supreme leader and so forth. That doesn't make any sense. And of course, yeah, they always try to play up this notion that there's an imminent threat that they had to preemptively strike in order to put a stop to. But I don't know. We've heard this ad nauseum. Do people forget that WMDs in Iraq? They're now like repeating WMD style talking points vis-a-vis Iran. There's no evidence that Iran was on the verge of somehow, blowing up American cities with their nuclear weapons. I mean, this is all just hype to justify this ideological program that Trump apparently barreled into office wanting to pursue, which was kind of like a global conquest, which makes this idea that Iran is going to conquer the world or Muslims are going to conquer the world all the more silly, because the only person on the planet who's actually doing that right now and has the power to do it to some degree anyway is Donald J. Trump. So if you're worried about world conquest, that's your guy to direct your complaints to.
I am neither for it or against it because I don't know. You're right. People just make up stuff, and they could just be making up this thing. Oh, we need to have this war. We need to do this. I don't know, so I'm neither for it or against it. But I do hope and believe that the president is doing because I've never seen anyone put America first like this before in government. I haven't seen it. I'm not saying it's never happened, but I just have never seen it. So I do appreciate the fact that the Great White Hope is putting America, doing his best to put America first, in spite of all the opposition from America and around the world. I like the fact that he put America first.
Well, it was a clever propaganda line for him to just trumpet this idea of America first and then have his sycophants and boosters trumpet it, because nobody could ever really define what that means. But when the common understanding of America first supposedly was that it was antithetical to overseas adventurism or overseas military conflict, because when you mention America first, that was supposed to be sort of in tension with this idea that we would now be having 20-year-olds and 26-year-olds, as we have this week, coming back in body bags from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia because they got killed in an Iranian reprisal strike. And then Trump has to go greet their remains
Right.
at Dover Air Force Base. Like, that wasn't America first in terms of how it was portrayed, but it was always a propagandistic talking point. It was always something that was infinitely malleable, that he could get the voters to think that he was going to come in and impose a program that actually devoted our wealth and resources nationally home rather than abroad. And he forgot to mention that he had these sort of crazed designs on some kind of worldwide imperial
Let me say this to
conquest.
you, Michael, because of time. We've totally run out of time now.
Mhm.
When I think of America first, I think shutting down the borders, stopping illegals from coming in, bring back jobs, uh, uh, and
But on foreign
protect.
policy,
So what?
what happened on foreign policy in particular?
I want him to protect us in that way, however that is. But when I think of America first, that's what I mean. Foreign policy, be good at that, whatever that means, and yet put America first and make sure we're safe, make sure we have jobs, and make sure we can buy homes, make sure that the illegals can't come in across the border. But let me ask, Michael, because of time, there's some people saying that President Trump is dragged into this war by Israel, and that Israel is controlling the Great White Hope. Is that true?
I think that's hyperbolic and overstated.
Okay.
His Trump supporters say this, but I think it is true on some level, especially in the second term when he has more free reign. than he did in the first term, and they structured the administration to kind of best channel his desires. Whereas in the first term, he tended to be impeded a bit more. I think I was on your show talking about Russiagate in the first term, where he had elements within the government, the federal government, kind of conniving against him. That's not the case anymore, right? So he has basically control as he sees fit over the apparatus of state. And so he has pretty unlimited power, especially in the domain of foreign policy, where presidents always have the most unfettered power to pursue what it is he wants to pursue. So, yeah, the war is being waged in concert with Israel. I'm not saying that Israel wasn't a factor. I'm not saying that Benjamin Netanyahu traveling constantly to the United States and huddling with Trump in Mar-a-Lago or wherever they huddle and making a case to him about why attacking Iran would be in both Israeli and U.S. interests. I'm not saying that didn't have any impact on Trump. I'm just saying, I think first and foremost, if we want to assign a cause to this, the cause flows from Donald J. Trump. As evidenced by him doing what he did in Venezuela or Greenland or wherever. That's got nothing to do with Israel. That's the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
And I would say this Iran thing is a continuation of that with Israel as sort of an adjunct.
Michael, your website.
mtracey.net, Tracey with an E.
Amazing discussion, man. Thank you. And I'll have you back again. I appreciate it.
All right. I enjoyed it. Take care.
All right. Bye now. Back in a moment, folks. 1 more hour to go to your phone calls. 1,000. It's better than silver and gold. So God bless you, man.